Throughout human history, soldiers went to battle for territory, honor, and their very existence. A warrior's purpose was connected to their king, their homeland, their bloodline, or their beliefs. Combat was savage, yes, but it meant something deeper. Then everything shifted. Warfare became disconnected from devotion. Combat turned into a transaction. And for the first time ever, battles could simply be purchased. Welcome to a place where wealth, influence, and the past intersect. And trust me, things are never as straightforward as they appear. The rise of hired soldiers didn't happen overnight with one dramatic battle or peace agreement. It crept in slowly, almost naturally, as societies evolved economically. When currency overtook territory as the true measure of strength, military forces adapted accordingly. Warriors no longer went to war out of duty to their masters. They fought because someone handed them coins. The moment that boundary disappeared, combat transformed from an extension of governance into a profit-driven industry. To grasp why paid fighters emerged, you need to look at what existed beforehand. In medieval times across Europe, military forces relied on feudal duty. Lords provided their monarchs with mandatory military service for a set number of days annually. Common farmers were drafted on short notice, usually with barely any preparation. These troops were undependable, only available part of the year, and incredibly ineffective. They functioned adequately for minor regional skirmishes. But they completely fell apart when nations expanded, accumulated wealth, and pursued grander ambitions. As the medieval period drew to a close, leaders encountered a serious challenge. Conflicts were dragging on longer. Urban centers were accumulating more riches. Commercial pathways required constant security. Boundaries demanded ongoing military presence. And traditional feudal conscription simply couldn't meet these demands. Devotion had its limits, obligations eventually ran out. Nobody was exactly thrilled about dying for somebody else's family power struggle in the first place. Currency provided an answer. As monetary systems grew stronger, rulers discovered they could directly employ fighting men. Paying soldiers addressed multiple issues simultaneously. Professional fighters were skilled. They practiced combat throughout the entire year. They could be sent into action at a moment's notice. They didn't vanish when crops needed harvesting. And crucially, they battled because it was their profession. Not because they had faith in the cause, but because they received payment. This wasn't about ethics changing. This was about practical necessity. Hired soldiers didn't appear because monarchs became greedy, but because governing became more complicated. Running a nation required consistency. Warfare needed dependability. And in an economy based on money, dependability came with a cost. This transformation became most obvious in the Italian city-states during the 1300s and 1400s. Florence, Venice, Milan, and their neighbors were rich, commercially sophisticated, and politically unstable. They possessed wealth, but lacked willing soldiers. Their populations consisted of traders, financiers, and craftsmen, not eager foot soldiers. So they hired outsiders to handle their fighting. This brought forth the condottieri. The condottieri were mercenary leaders who operated private military forces like commercial enterprises. They hammered out agreements called condot that outlined compensation, length of employment, troop quantities, and even how much danger was acceptable. These weren't wild, reckless commanders. They were careful business operators. Their forces represented investments. Losing troops meant losing future earnings. Consequently, the nature of warfare shifted. Battles became less conclusive. Combat encounters were carefully planned. Prolonged sieges took the place of bloody confrontations. Leaders avoided needless casualties, not from compassion, but from business sense. A fully operational army held more worth than a glorious triumph. A surviving soldier could be hired out again tomorrow. A fallen one couldn't. This represents one of the biggest contradictions of the mercenary period. Paid professional soldiers frequently waged war less savagely than feudal conscripts, but their motivations were far more calculating. Combat wasn't about noble ideals. It was about protecting investment, and that included human resources. However, this professionalism carried a price. Devotion became negotiable. When payment ceased, so did service. When someone made a superior proposal, loyalty switched sides. Certain condottieri infamously betrayed their employers during active conflicts. Others intentionally prolonged wars, understanding that continued chaos increased the market for their skills. Once violence turned into a commodity, motivations followed the cash flow. And here lies the essence of the mercenary transformation. Nations forfeited their exclusive control over military force. When armies answered to monarchs, authority remained concentrated. When armies answered to contracts, authority scattered. Military capability no longer rested purely on rightful rule or faithful service. It rested on financial resources. Anyone with money could wage war. Anyone without it faced defeat. No matter how just or noble their purpose happened to be, treasure mattered more than thrones. This transformation didn't merely alter battlefield results, it fundamentally changed politics. Leaders had to make taxation and loans their top priority to sustain military strength. Wars turned into tests of financial stamina. Success went not to the most courageous, but to the most financially equipped. And nations that couldn't manage their budgets became completely vulnerable. Not from cowardice, but from empty coffers. Mercenaries also transformed how violence and ethics connected. A warrior defending their native land might think twice before harming innocent people. A warrior working for wages answers to a signed agreement, not to moral principles. Structure replaced philosophy. Following orders replaced personal conviction. Terrible acts didn't occur because hired soldiers were naturally vicious, but because their reasons for fighting were purely financial. When violence gets reduced to professional service, self-restraint must be imposed from outside. And imposing control requires funding. There's a subtle thread connecting this entire evolution. When devotion carries a price tag, it also comes with documentation. The mercenary transformation didn't destroy loyalty. It assigned it a market value. And once loyalty could be purchased, it could be outbid by competitors. This sparked a vicious cycle. Nations generated more income to outspend their enemies. Tax burdens grew heavier, national debt ballooned. Economic structures became impossible to separate from military strength. Warfare was no longer purely about tactical planning. It became about financial survival. By the beginning of the modern era, rulers recognized the threat they'd created. Military forces that could be purchased could also switch allegiance. Authority dependent on regular payments could disappear in an instant. So governments reacted the only way they understood, by incorporating the mercenary system directly into the state structure. Permanent national armies weren't created from noble principles, but from genuine fear. Monarchs centralized recruitment processes, standardized compensation, and introduced uniforms not to bring back honor, but to manage economic incentives. Warriors became full-time government employees. Allegiance was no longer bargained for agreement by agreement. It was maintained through administration, strict discipline, and steady salaries. Technically speaking, the age of mercenaries had concluded. In truth, it had merely been absorbed into government. The fundamental logic stayed identical. Soldiers still fought because they drew paychecks. The only difference was which institution issued those paychecks. This transition locked governments into never-ending financial commitments. Standing military forces demanded constant funding whether at peace or war. Tax collection had to increase. Taking on debt became standard practice. Complete financial frameworks were restructured to maintain military salaries. The contemporary nation-state didn't simply emerge at the same time as permanent armies. It was constructed specifically to sustain them. If they handed out awards for refusing to acknowledge financial reality, government officials would still be winning them today. Because when violence relies on steady cash flow, warfare turns into a budgeting challenge before it becomes a military challenge. Nations stopped asking, "Is this conflict morally right?" They started asking, "Do we have the funds for this?" And that single question transformed everything from tax policy to national banking. The 1600s and 1700s converted warfare into a competition between financial ledgers. Britain didn't control Europe by deploying the biggest military forces. It dominated by creating the most advanced financial infrastructure, extended government borrowing, unified tax systems, trustworthy lending institutions, These weren't economic bonuses, they were absolute military requirements. France discovered this truth through painful experience. Excessive spending on military forces without corresponding financial improvements helped drive the monarchy toward complete bankruptcy. By 1789, the crown still commanded armies, but possessed no financial stability. The French Revolution wasn't sparked solely by revolutionary ideas. It was sparked by an empty national treasury. Currency didn't just finance conflicts. It determined who would survive them. And this is exactly where the mercenary mentality quietly reappears in our current world. The 1900s claimed to have buried hired soldiers beneath nationalism and mandatory military service. Citizens fought for their countries, not for wages, at least according to official narratives. But even during that time, the economic machinery kept operating without pause. Soldiers still earned compensation. Private companies still provided weapons and supplies. Corporations still made profits. War was presented as patriotic obligation, but functioned as commercial enterprise. Then, as the century approached its end, the facade cracked. Private military corporations resurfaced. Not as lawless mercenary bands, but as legitimate business organizations. They provided security services, supply chains, professional training, and direct combat operations. Governments employed them to minimize political fallout, circumvent personnel restrictions, and delegate responsibility. These weren't medieval condottieri carrying swords into battle. They were corporations with legal departments, billing systems, and investor expectations. The mercenary transformation hadn't come back around. It had simply upgraded itself. In today's world, violence has once again become a purchasable service. It's organized, overseen by regulations, and marketed professionally. Agreements outline what's covered. Legal responsibility is carefully structured. Deaths get recategorized. And accountability becomes blurred beyond recognition. When disasters happen, it's almost never obvious who should answer for it. The government, the private contractor, or the economic system that enabled everything. Nothing screams stable arrangement quite like needing a corporate firm to fight wars you can politically justify fighting yourself. The underlying reality is more uncomfortable to face. Once violence becomes something you can compartmentalize, deploy anywhere, charge for, and deny responsibility for, it makes starting conflicts easier. Political leaders face reduced consequences at home. Wars become simpler to launch and more difficult to conclude. Not because humanity has a hunger for violence, but because the systems in place no longer create resistance against it. This mirrors the exact pattern from the mercenary era. When military forces were costly but expendable, the number of wars multiplied. When loyalty operated on transactions, creating instability became lucrative. When soldiers represented financial assets, peace hurt the bottom line. And the economic effects don't remain confined to combat zones. Contemporary conflicts warp economies in recognizable patterns. Military budgets explode outward. Rising prices follow close behind. Government debt expands massively. Whole geographical regions become reliant on security industry contracts. Rebuilding destroyed areas becomes yet another profit opportunity. War sustains itself, not because it lacks logic, but because it's woven into financial systems. The people who pay the least suffer the most consequences. Regular citizens absorb the true costs through taxation, inflation, and missed opportunities. Those controlling capital protect themselves. Those holding contracts get wealthier. The arrangement rewards those furthest removed from actual consequences exactly as it always has. Remove the military uniforms, national symbols, and inspiring speeches, and the mercenary formula remains shockingly straightforward. Whoever possesses the financial resources directs the violence. Whoever directs the violence determines how the system operates. This isn't a discussion about right and wrong. This is about understanding motivations and incentives. The mercenary transformation offers a lesson that remains relevant in our time. When military force can be bought and sold, moral considerations become secondary. Maintaining stability relies not on good character, but on proper supervision. And supervision requires funding, meaning the system only regulates itself when it's economically feasible to do so. History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but if you fail to learn from it, it'll destroy you just the same. The instant armies stopped serving monarchs and started serving whoever paid them, warfare stopped being an occasional occurrence and became a permanent fixture. Not because human nature transformed, but because the underlying economics transformed. If this shifted how you see things, make sure to subscribe. History holds all the answers, and I'm here to reveal where you should be looking.